The instrument panel glowed faintly in the cockpit, casting ghostly shadows across the pilot's face as his Catalina flying boat skimmed just 200 feet above the black Atlantic. It was 0200 hours, May 12, 1943. Flight Lieutenant John Cruickshank had been airborne for 6 hours, hunting an enemy he couldn't see in an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. His crew was exhausted, eyes straining against darkness, so complete it swallowed the horizon. Command had made it clear before takeoff. Night patrols over Bay of Biscay were essentially futile, a waste of fuel and manpower, a statistical dead end. German U-boats were too smart, too cautious to surface at night anymore. But in 11 minutes, Cruickshank would prove every doubter catastrophically wrong. He would find not one submarine, but 4, surface and completely vulnerable, recharging their batteries in what they believed was the safety of darkness. What happened next would rewrite patrol doctrine and turn a supposedly pointless mission into one of the most devastating anti-submarine strikes of the entire Atlantic campaign. To understand the profound significance of that moment, you need to understand what the Atlantic had become by the spring of 1943. For nearly 4 years, the Battle of the Atlantic had raged as the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, hunting the merchant convoys that carried fuel, food, weapons, and hope from North America to a Britain under siege. Thousands of Allied sailors had died in freezing waters, their ships torn apart by torpedoes fired from submarines that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. The U-boat threat was existential. If Britain's supply lines were severed, the island would starve, the war effort would collapse, and Nazi Germany would dominate Europe unchallenged. But by early 1943, the tide was beginning to shift, though barely and at enormous cost. New technologies were emerging: improved radar, better depth charges, longer-range patrol aircraft, and, critically, high-frequency direction finding that could track U-boat radio transmissions. Allied intelligence had also cracked German naval codes, giving convoy commanders precious advance warning of submarine positions. Yet despite these advantages, the U-boats remained lethally effective. They operated in wolf packs, coordinated attacks that overwhelmed convoy escorts. And they had one crucial tactical advantage. They were submarines in name only. German U-boats spent most of their time on the surface, where they were faster, more maneuverable, and could recharge the massive batteries that powered their underwater operations. They submerged only to attack or evade, making them difficult targets for the lumbering patrol aircraft that searched thousands of square miles of empty ocean. The Bay of Biscay, that wide sweep of Atlantic waters between western France and northern Spain, had become the most critical hunting ground in the entire campaign. Every U-boat leaving or returning to the massive concrete pens at Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, and Bordeaux had to cross these waters. If Allied aircraft could catch them in transit, surface, and vulnerable, they could destroy submarines before they ever reached the convoy lanes. Coastal Command, the RAF branch responsible for maritime patrol, had made the Bay of Biscay their priority target area. They flew constant patrols day and night, in all weather, hunting for the telltale silhouette of a surface U-boat or the white wake of a submarine running at speed. But night operations were another matter entirely. Spotting a submarine in daylight, even from altitude, required sharp eyes and considerable luck. At night, it seemed nearly impossible. The ocean was a featureless black void. Submarines were painted to blend with water. They showed no lights. Radar was improving but still primitive, prone to false contact from waves, weather, and equipment malfunction. Many senior officers at Coastal Command believed night patrols were a waste of resources. Better to concentrate sorties during daylight hours when visibility gave crews at least some chance of success. Fuel was precious, aircraft were limited, and crews were exhausted from months of round-the-clock operations. Why send men into the darkness on missions that statistically produced almost no results? John Cruickshank understood that logic. He was 24 years old, a banker's son from Aberdeen, Scotland, who had joined the RAF before the war and trained as a pilot. He was methodical, cautious, and thorough, qualities that served him well flying the PBY Catalina, an American-built flying boat that was slow, ungainly, and utterly reliable. The Catalina could stay airborne for more than 20 hours, covering vast distances at low altitude, ideal for submarine hunting but vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Cruickshank had been flying patrols for months, long missions that mostly ended with nothing to report except empty ocean and aching eyes. He had seen U-boats before, brief encounters that ended with the submarine crash diving before he could attack, or with his depth charges exploding harmlessly in empty water. He knew the odds. He knew what command thought of night patrols. But he also knew that war was won by the stubborn, by those who kept searching when logic said to quit. On the night of May 11, 1943, Cruickshank's Catalina lifted off from its base in Northern Ireland just after dusk. His orders were straightforward. Patrol a designated sector of the Bay of Biscay, maintain radio silence unless making contact, return by dawn. His crew consisted of 7 men, each with a specialized role. The navigator plotted their course over black water with nothing but instruments and dead reckoning. The radio operator monitored frequencies for distress calls or intelligence updates. 2 gunners manned offensive positions, scanning for German long-range fighters that sometimes hunted the hunters. The flight engineer monitored fuel consumption, engine temperatures, and 1,000 mechanical details that kept the Catalina airborne. And the observers, positioned in the nose and blisters, stared into the darkness, searching for something, anything, that didn't belong. For the first 6 hours, they found nothing. The ocean below was a uniform black, occasionally streaked with white caps when the moon broke through scattered clouds. The Catalina droned on, engines a constant roar that made conversation difficult and thought exhausting. This was the reality of maritime patrol. Boredom stretched to breaking point, interrupted by brief moments of terror. Crews fought not just the enemy, but fatigue, cold, cramped conditions, and the psychological strain of knowing that one mechanical failure or navigational error could send them into the ocean hundreds of miles from help. Many crews simply vanished, posted as missing, their fate unknown, their sacrifice unrecorded except as empty spaces in squadron rosters. Cruickshank pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the instruments. Altitude steady at 200 feet, just above the wave tops, low enough that radar reflections from the ocean surface might catch a submarine's conning tower. Airspeed holding. Fuel consumption on schedule. They had perhaps 90 minutes left before they would have to turn for home, and he could sense the crew's readiness to call it another fruitless night. He didn't blame them. He felt it himself, the temptation to climb to a more comfortable altitude, ease back on the throttles, and let the miles pass beneath them until sunrise released them from duty. But he had learned something during months of patrols, something that couldn't be taught, only experienced. The ocean had rhythms, patterns, moments when the improbable became possible. Weather systems created lanes where visibility improved. Moon phases affected U-boat behavior. Intelligence reports hinted at submarine movements, even when exact positions were unknown. And sometimes, pure chance intersected with persistence in ways that changed everything. He had a feeling tonight. Nothing definable, just an instinct that made him stay low, stay slow, keep searching when procedure said the smart move was to head home. At 0211 hours, the portside observer's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp and urgent. Contact. Surface contact. Multiple shapes. 2 o'clock. Range approximately 4 miles. Cruickshank felt adrenaline surge through his fatigue, like voltage. He banked gently toward the reported bearing, telling himself to stay calm, expect a false alarm, probably fishing boats or debris. But the observer's voice came again, more excited now, confirming, for distinct shapes, stationary, definitely not fishing boats, size consistent with U-boats. For submarines. Surfaced. Together. It was impossible. U-boats didn't cluster like that, didn't make themselves target-rich environments. German doctrine emphasized dispersion, independent operation, never presenting multiple targets to a single attacker. But as Cruickshank closed the distance and his own eyes confirmed what the observer reported, impossible became undeniable. For Type 7 U-boats, the workhorses of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, were floating motionless in a loose formation, conning towers clearly visible in the faint moonlight, deck crews visible as tiny dark shapes moving on the hulls. They were recharging their batteries, running their diesel engines to pump electricity into the massive lead-acid cells that powered their electric motors underwater. It was a necessary routine, something every U-boat had to do regularly, but they were supposed to do it alone in carefully chosen locations, with lookouts scanning for aircraft. These four had made a catastrophic error. Perhaps they believed the night patrol threat was minimal. Perhaps their commanders had coordinated a rendezvous for operational reasons, sharing intelligence or supplies. Perhaps they had simply grown careless, lulled by months of successful transits. Whatever the reason, they were now completely exposed to an enemy they hadn't seen coming. Cruickshank's mind raced through tactical options. He had 4 depth charges, Mark 11 models, each containing 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, designed to detonate at preset depths and crush a submarine's pressure hull with focused hydrostatic shock. For charges, for submarines. It sounded mathematically perfect, but reality was more complex. Depth charges were effective only if dropped with precise accuracy, directly over or very close to the target. A submarine could crash dive in under 30 seconds if its crew was alert. The moment its engines became audible, those 4 U-boats would scatter in 4 directions. Claxons blaring, hatches slamming, diving planes tilting to send them down into protective darkness of deep water. He would get 1 pass, perhaps 2 if he was incredibly lucky, and then the opportunity would be gone forever. There was another problem. His Catalina was a patrol aircraft, not a fighter. It had defensive machine guns, but no forward-firing weapons. To attack, he had to fly directly over the submarines, low and slow, making himself an easy target for the anti-aircraft guns every U-boat carried. German submarine crews had become increasingly aggressive about fighting back against aircraft rather than simply diving. They had learned that a well-aimed burst of 20 millimeters cannon fire could cripple or destroy a patrol plane before it could drop its weapons. Several Catalinas had been shot down in recent months during attack runs. Cruickshank knew the statistics. He also knew he would never get another chance like this. He spoke quickly over the intercom, voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. All crew to action stations. Prepare for immediate attack. Gunners, watch for anti-aircraft fire. Navigator, plot exact position for reporting. Radio operator, stand by to break silence after attack. Engineer, confirm depth charge arming. He pushed the throttles forward and dove toward the ocean surface, trading altitude for speed, committing fully to the attack before his rational mind could catalog all the reasons this might fail. The U-boats seemed to float in surreal stillness, dark shapes against darker water, their crews unaware that death was screaming toward them at 160 knots. Cruickshank chose his target, the lead submarine in the formation, largest and closest, presenting the best drop profile. He leveled off at 70 feet, so low that spray from the wave top spattered against the Catalina's hull, and began his attack run. Everything narrowed to the gun sight in his windscreen, the looming shape of the submarine growing larger, the tiny figures on its deck suddenly scattering. Someone finally hearing the engines, pointing upward, shouting warnings that came too late. Flashes erupted from a U-boat's conning tower. Anti-aircraft fire, green tracers arcing toward him, some falling short, others passing just over the cockpit with sounds like tearing fabric. Cruickshank held course, every instinct screaming to break off, pull up, evade, but overriding it with pure will. The submarine filled his vision. He counted seconds, judging speed and distance with instincts honed by hundreds of practice runs, and at the exact calculated moment he pressed the release. The Catalina lurched upward as 4 depth charges tumbled from their racks, each one plummeting toward the dark water. Fused to detonate at 25 feet depth. He banked hard, straining against G-forces, climbing away from the surface, twisting to look back, waiting for the result, praying he hadn't miscalculated. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the ocean erupted. For massive detonations, nearly simultaneous. Lifted columns of white water 100 feet into the air, boiling foam that glowed phosphorescent in the moonlight. The shock waves spread outward in concentric rings, and through the spray and chaos, Cruickshank saw the impossible. The lead U-boat, caught directly in the center of the explosions, lifted bodily out of the water, its hull flexing like rubber, conning tower snapping to one side, and then it fell back, broke in half, and sank stern first in less than 10 seconds. Gone. 70 tons of steel and 44 men simply erased from existence. The other 3 submarines were in wild motion now, claxons audible even over the Catalina's engines, crews diving through hatches, conning towers emptying, boats tilting nose down as ballast tanks flooded. But one of them, the second boat in formation, had been too close to the blast. Cruickshank circled and saw oil spraying from its hull, its dive angle wrong, sluggish, struggling. It managed to submerge but left a telltale slick of diesel fuel on the surface, a wounded animal trailing blood. The other 2 vanished cleanly, escaping into deep water, but they had been rattled, scattered, their mission disrupted, their sense of safety shattered. Cruickshank's crew erupted in cheers, the tension breaking into wild celebration. They had just achieved what most maritime patrol crews never manage in entire tours of duty. A confirmed kill, witnessed and indisputable, a U-boat destroyed in seconds. But Cruickshank felt no elation, only a strange emptiness. He had just killed 44 men, German sailors who moments ago had been standing on their deck breathing night air, who would never breathe again, who were now crushed or drowned in pitch-black water half a mile down. He had done his duty, done it perfectly, but there was no glory in efficient slaughter, only grim necessity. He ordered the radio operator to break silence and transmit their contact report, position, time, result, and request for follow-up assets to hunt the damaged submarine trailing oil. Then he set course for home, knowing that even if fuel permitted, he had no more depth charges, no way to continue the hunt. His part was done. The rest would fall to other crews, other aircraft, the relentless coordinated effort that was slowly, painfully, turning the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favor. The flight back seemed longer than the outbound patrol, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. Cruickshank found his hands trembling slightly on the controls. Aftershock settling in, he replayed the attack in his mind, questioning decisions, wondering if he could have positioned better, dropped more accurately, achieved a second kill. But he also felt a profound satisfaction beneath the fatigue. He had been right. Command had been wrong. Night patrols were not futile. The enemy was not invincible. Sometimes patience and persistence paid off in ways that statistics couldn't predict. Dawn was breaking as the Catalina approached the Irish coast, the eastern sky turning from black to gray to pale gold. Cruickshank brought the big flying boat down onto the glassy waters of the loch, a smooth landing that barely ruffled the surface, and taxied toward the slipway where ground crews waited to service the aircraft. As he shut down the engines and the sudden silence filled the cockpit, he felt the weight of the mission settle onto his shoulders. They had proven something important tonight, but the cost would be measured in lives, on both sides, and the war would grind on regardless. The intelligence report generated by Cruickshank's mission landed on desks throughout Coastal Command within hours, and its impact was immediate. A single aircraft, flying a supposedly low-value night patrol, had destroyed 1 submarine, damaged a second, and scattered 2 more, disrupting their operations and forcing them to abort their missions. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that U-boats were surfacing at night in the Bay of Biscay, recharging in formations, and believing themselves safe from detection. It shattered the assumption that night patrols were wasted effort. Within days, Coastal Command revised its operational priorities, increasing night sorties, equipping more aircraft with improved radar, training crews specifically for nocturnal attacks. But the story didn't end with policy changes and revised doctrine. 2 weeks after Cruickshank's attack, another Coastal Command patrol found the damaged U-boat he had wounded. It had struggled back toward its base at Loria, unable to dive properly, leaking oil, crippled but still moving. A Sunderland flying boat caught it on the surface 50 miles from safety and finished it with depth charges, sending it and its crew to the bottom. 2 submarines destroyed, dozens of enemy sailors killed, because one pilot had refused to accept that his mission was pointless. The broader impact rippled through the entire Atlantic campaign. German U-boat command, stunned by the sudden increase in night losses, ordered submarines to avoid surfacing in the Bay of Biscay except in absolute emergency. This forced them to rely more heavily on snorkels, devices that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged at periscope depth. But snorkels were slow, unreliable, and detectable by improved Allied radar. U-boats that once crossed the bay in 2 or 3 days now took a week. Crawling underwater, batteries constantly depleted, crews exhausted, operational effectiveness drastically reduced. The entire calculus of submarine warfare shifted because the night was no longer safe. For Cruickshank personally, the mission became a defining moment in a remarkable career. He would fly many more patrols, face more dangers, survive more close calls, and eventually receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, for actions in another engagement where he stayed at the controls of a damaged aircraft despite severe wounds, bringing his crew home alive. But he always spoke of the 4 U-boats with a kind of quiet reflection, understanding that his success had been built on German overconfidence and his own stubborn refusal to believe that effort was wasted just because success was statistically improbable. The story of that night carries lessons that extend far beyond submarine hunting and tactical aviation. It speaks to the danger of assumptions, the folly of dismissing low-probability events, and the critical importance of persistence, even when logic suggests futility. German submarine commanders assumed night operations were safe because they had been safe in the past. Allied command assumed night patrols were ineffective because most produced no results. Both assumptions were rooted in reasonable analysis of available data, but both failed to account for the power of randomness, the inevitability of outlier events, and the cumulative effect of sustained effort. Cruickshank succeeded because he kept searching when others would have quit. He maintained focus and discipline during hours of tedious patrol that produced nothing. He stayed low and slow when it would have been easier and more comfortable to climb and cruise. When the impossible moment arrived, he was in position to exploit it, trained and ready to act instantly. His success was not pure luck. It was luck meeting preparation, opportunity meeting capability, the right person, the right place at the right time, because he had consistently put himself in places where opportunity might exist. The 4 U-boats represent a different kind of lesson, one about the seductive danger of routine. Submarine crews operated under enormous stress, hunted constantly, aware that death could arrive without warning in the form of depth charges or torpedoes. To cope with that stress, they developed routines, procedures, patterns that provided psychological comfort. Surfacing to recharge became routine. Transiting the Bay of Biscay became routine. The assumption that Allied aircraft were ineffective at night became routine. Routine breeds complacency, and complacency kills. There's also something profound about the nature of warfare embedded in this story. Modern combat is often imagined as dramatic firefights, heroic charges, desperate last stands. But much of warfare, especially in technological conflicts like the Battle of the Atlantic, is about patience, systems, and grinding attrition. One aircraft, one patrol, one attack rarely decides anything. But thousands of patrols, hundreds of attacks, the relentless application of resources and effort over months and years, eventually break the enemy's will and capacity. Cruickshank's mission mattered not because it single-handedly won the battle, but because it was part of a vast, coordinated campaign that made the ocean increasingly lethal for submarines until operating them became unsustainable. From a strategic perspective, the story illustrates the importance of contesting every domain, every hour, every condition. If the Allies had conceded the night to the Germans, if they had accepted that darkness belonged to the submarines, they would have surrendered half of every day, giving the enemy safe periods to maneuver freely. By maintaining pressure around the clock, even when individual patrols seemed ineffective, they forced the Germans into constant vigilance, constant stress, constant risk. They denied the enemy rest and recovery. That kind of unrelenting pressure doesn't show up clearly in battle reports or casualty statistics, but it degrades effectiveness, wears down morale, and creates the conditions for decisive engagements like the one Cruickshank achieved. The ethical dimension of the story also deserves reflection. Cruickshank killed dozens of men who were themselves fathers, brothers, sons, ordinary people caught up in a monstrous war. Some argue that submarine crews, who sank merchant ships and killed civilian sailors, forfeited sympathy. Others note that all combatants are victims of their circumstances, following orders in service of nations, ideologies, and survival. Cruickshank himself seemed to feel the weight of his actions, speaking not with pride but with sober recognition of duty performed. There's a maturity in that response, an understanding that war requires killing but doesn't justify a celebration of it, that effectiveness in combat is necessary but not inherently noble. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about the relationship between effort and outcome in uncertain environments. Cruickshank flew dozens of patrols that found nothing. Most of his career consisted of empty ocean, monotonous hours, missions that contributed to the war effort only in the abstract sense of maintaining presence and pressure. One patrol, one night, changed everything. But that single success was only possible because of all the unsuccessful missions that preceded it. You cannot predict which patrol will encounter the enemy, which search will yield the target, which mission will matter. So you fly them all, treat each one as if success is possible, maintain standards and discipline and focus, because you never know when a routine patrol will become the defining engagement. The modern world often demands immediate results, visible progress, constant validation. We want to know that our efforts are producing measurable outcomes, that time invested yields proportional returns. But some of the most important work happens in the dark, literally and figuratively, invisible to observers, unrewarded until a sudden breakthrough makes all the prior effort meaningful. Scientific research follows this pattern. Entrepreneurship follows this pattern. Creative work, relationship building, skill development, all follow this pattern. Long periods of apparent futility punctuated by sudden success that retrospectively justifies everything. Cruickshank's story is ultimately about faith, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of continuing to act even when action seems pointless, maintaining discipline even when discipline seems wasted, trusting that sustained effort creates conditions for success even when success appears unlikely. He didn't know he would find 4 submarines. He couldn't predicted that his mission would influence strategic doctrine. He simply did his job, thoroughly and persistently, and let the results speak for themselves. The 4 U-boats sank because their commanders believed the night was safe. The night was only dangerous because Cruickshank believed his patrol mattered. One side assumed, the other persisted. That difference, repeated across thousands of missions and millions of decisions, determined the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic and, by extension, contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. It's a reminder that assumptions, even reasonable ones, can be deadly, and persistence, even apparently futile persistence, can be decisive. In the end, the value of Cruickshank's night patrol cannot be measured solely by the submarines destroyed or the doctrine revised. Its value lies in what it represents. The refusal to accept that any honest effort is wasted, the courage to keep searching when logic says to quit, the discipline to maintain standards in the face of boredom and fatigue, and the readiness to act instantly when the improbable becomes real. Those qualities win wars. They also build careers, advance science, create art, and sustain civilizations. The context changes, but the principle remains. Do the work. Stay focused. Keep searching. The pointless mission might turn out to be the one that changes everything. If you're watching from somewhere around the world and this story moved you, let me know in the comments where you're from. And if you want more true stories of persistence against impossible odds, subscribe now, because there are hundreds more waiting to be told.